Welcome everybody to our October Pathways to Adult Success Solution Forum. Today we have a very powerful topic, I believe, reimagining high school for a post-pandemic world. You go to the next slide, Amanda. And this is, everyone is in thinking about the impacts of the pandemic and where we're going to go from there is, we all have this desire to sort of, build back better, as the phrase goes. And we're trying to make the case today that there's no place better to start than with our high school and our high school into post-secondary design. That's really a key area that we need to really rethink and reimagine. So it works for the 21st century and really enables all kids, right, to have a pathway through high school into post-secondary schooling or training. As we know, there's little work to support a family if that doesn't happen. And if you can make the case that the fundamental job of our public education system should be to prepare each generation to be able to support a family, right? And have that family thrive and have a strong future. So we have some great guests today. We have Eddie Branchaud and Mark Heath from ERS are going to be talking to us about rethinking the idea of credit recovery. We're going to hear a little bit about the work we've been doing at the Everett Graduate Center with Cross-State High School Redesign. And then we're going to have Joel Vargas from Jobs to the Future talking about the big blur. Their brand new report out on erasing the boundaries between high school and college and career. Maybe the best redesign for high school is not to have a high school anymore. We'll see. And as you can see, it sort of builds from like the level of change builds across our presentations. And that's just to get us thinking about there's many different ways to reimagine and redesign high schools for a post-pandemic world. And then we will open it up. There's a lot of knowledgeable and experienced folks on the phone call today. And we'll open it up to you to a Q&A after each of the talks. And then we'll have a larger Q&A at the end. We ask you along the way, and you can go to the next slide, Amanda, to use the chat function as folks are speaking. Put your questions in there, put your comments in there. If you have a resource to share your resource. And then when we get to the Q&A section, we'll pull those questions in from the chat and have a dialogue. And as always, after the session, we'll be sending out the recording, the resources that are shared here today, links to the larger resources of the participants' organizations. So you'll be getting a good follow-up package of things you can use to help keep the dialogue and the discussion going. All right, so to kick this off, again, just wanted to, we're centering this idea of pathways to adult success, right? And the point that this has never been so crucial, right? The pandemic has disrupted sort of existing systems, existing means of doing this. I don't know if you saw it, but there was a new report out in Ed Week, I think just today, showing that graduates for the class of 2021 are almost having a harder post-secondary transition than the class of 2020, which got interrupted in March. And there's been just increasing struggles in making that transition because of the pandemic. Uncertainty is the norm. And yet we also know from all of our work that it's so critical to having that pathway to adult success to making that transition from high school to post-secondary is momentum. And anything that disrupts momentum is problematic. And so that's really one of the things I think we're really trying to think through with our redesign ideas here for high schools, which is how to keep that momentum going and not have it get sort of like pushed, paused or stopped or diverted. All right. And so the final thing I want to do to set this up is that there's been a number, and didn't have time to get the Ed Week poll in today, just saw it. But there's been a number of various surveys that have been done by different organizations just this month, September and October, which I think really makes the case for high school redesign. And I thought that would just be a nice framing for what's to follow, is to really hear where our students are at the moment. So the first one comes from a survey done by America's Promise Alliance of 13 to 18-year-olds. Fortunately, most say they plan to graduate high school on time, but many are feeling that their high school experience is not preparing them for life after graduation. And if you look through these, we're basically getting F's and D's from the folks we're supposed to be making this work for, right? About what I learn in class is necessary for my future success. I learned valuable skills in schools. My high school experience is preparing me for success. There's a full 1/3 of students or more who feel that's not the case currently. And if our goal is to make this work for all kids, that tells us there's work to do. Next slide. Another group of students was asked, and these were graduates of the class of 2020 and 2021 who paused, who stopped after high school and sort of didn't immediately go on to college. And they were asked, what would have helped you? What would help you get more education? And the number one pick was an advisor, followed by some connection to work, followed by obviously financial aid, but then we have career pathways and we have accessible and flexible schedules, right? So it's clearly that they're looking, there's a theme of guidance there, right? Of different types and some structure, right? Interestingly enough, right? They don't want it just to be, the world's your oyster, figure it out, right? They are looking for some help and structure along the way, is what you could infer from that. Next slide. Another group, people have been busy talking to students, that's fantastic. Ask them what they thought is most important to learn in high school. It's interestingly that this heading was from the people who did it. It came as a package deal. I couldn't quite put my own title on it. And they're highlighting the top two, right? Which was skills for future employment and to become independent learners. And those are interesting because you don't necessarily always see those juxtaposed right side by side with sort of equal weighting. But what I also found interesting is if you take the dark green and the lighter green, because the lighter green is still very important, the dark green is extremely important, you can see that most things ranked had the majority of kids saying this mattered, right? Everything from how to be a good citizen, how to interact with others, values and morals, fix social problems, which strikes me as saying is that kids want high school to do a lot, right? It isn't actually just do this one narrow thing. There is a wide range of things they are looking for their school to do for them, which I think also speaks to both the need and some inspiration and some challenges for when we think about redesign and reimagining high schools for the post-pandemic world. And let's see. And our last one, they ask kids what they think about, kids have now had experience with virtual learning and in-person learning and all kinds of combinations. And this is from September. So it's always a grain of salt because it's always a moving target with their experience. But in September, about half the kids were like, I want to be in school every day. But about 40% were like, nah, 2 to 4 days a week seems pretty good to be in the building. And the rest of the time I'm okay, like learning on my own. And we had 10% were like, I don't want to ever go back to that building. I was good outside of it. And I think that speaks to some challenges, right? Because that's some split opinion, right? At least in this moment in time, right? But it does argue again for some flexibility built into the system. At the same time, we saw some evidence of a desire for structure too, right? So it's just speaking to that. I think there's just a lot of rich insights to be gained there, but they don't necessarily lead to a straightforward up. Clearly, the path forward to redesign high schools is this, like all. So with that, it's a great time to now hear from our presenters and to dig deeper into some of these issues. And we're going to kick it off and start with Eddie and Mark from Educational Resource Strategies, talking about redesigning credit recovery for lasting learning and broader change. Eddie and Mark, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. Really appreciate you helping to set the stage here today, and for everyone else for joining us in today's conversation about investing ESSER funding to redesign credit recovery for lasting learning and broader change. Before we dive in, just wanted to spend a few seconds quickly introducing ourselves and Education Resource Strategies. My name is Mark Heath. I'm an associate at ERS, and I'm joined here today with my colleague, Eddie Branchaud, who's a manager at ERS. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So just quickly, Education Resource Strategies, or ERS, is a national nonprofit, and we partner with district, school, and state leaders to transform how they use resources so that all students are prepared for tomorrow. Our expertise in resource allocation focuses primarily on people, time, and money to create broader system-level change for districts. Recently, we've been supporting school districts in planning to use this unprecedented level of funding to address urgent needs and create lasting change in their districts. Next slide, please. As part of this work, we put out a series of guides for ESSER spending, scheduling, and staffing that build on existing research and examples from the field to show how schools and districts can invest in key strategies with an eye towards sustainability. We're excited to talk with you all this afternoon about credit recovery, how it can serve students, and how it can be part of broader high school redesign. Next slide. So there have been lots of discussions in recent years about credit recovery. They often start with a few observations. First, as you can see here on the left, national graduation rates have risen steadily since they started being measured for accountability under No Child Left Behind. From 2011 to 2019, as shown here, they increased from 79 to 86%. However, as you can see on the right, achievement measures have not increased over the same time across various examples of different assessments, national, state, SAT, and ACT. And as we all know, performance gaps on standardized tests still persist across different student groups and identities. And many have pointed to the growth of credit recovery programs, especially as they are increasingly online, as one reason that graduation rates continue to rise while achievement does not. Next slide. According to Department of Education survey, roughly 89% of high schools offer some form of credit recovery, and as many as 15% of students participate. We see that schools with higher participation rates tend to have more students from low-income backgrounds as well. There is unfortunately limited research on the impacts of credit recovery, but the studies that have been done are fairly aligned on at least 2 points. The first is that credit recovery programs are pretty good at getting students to graduation and to graduate. And second, they are generally not as good at increasing student performance. And now the demand for credit recovery will likely be on the rise. There isn't a great source or national data on course failure rates, though one estimate that I saw today published from in the 74 estimated about 1.1 million students from last year to this year have dropped out. But there are a number of reports of increased course failures in districts across the country, particularly for students of color who were more likely to be learning remotely last year. Understandably, districts might be looking to expand their credit recovery options in response to this need. So given the shaky data on learning outcomes, our key question at ERS really became how can districts and schools do credit recovery in ways that really support students and create lasting change. So next slide. So based on the available research and examples we are seeing in districts across the country, we believe that students will be successful in credit recovery programs that prioritize kind of these 3 key components. First, credit recovery programs should utilize assigned staff to provide instructional support to students. And we heard that a little bit in the data that Bob had mentioned earlier in the presentation about kind of this guidance and adult support for students. Second, credit recovery programs that focus on unmastered competencies for each individual student, rather than equating learning to kind of past metrics of seat time or units covered. And third, credit recovery programs that are flexible, giving students a variety of options for engaging where, when, and how they are able. Again, that was in some of the data that Bob mentioned earlier today. And so that might mean thinking about summers, evenings, Saturdays, and extended school days. And so what does this look like? Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Here are 2 examples that we found to be particularly innovative in our kind of research and work across the country for positively influencing students' experiences in credit recovery. So the first is from DCPS. They launched a completely redesigned credit recovery program in 2018-2019 that prioritizes competency-based courses. These courses are developed by district staff and teachers. They're aligned to the district curriculum, and importantly, they include kind of just-in-time face-to-face support from teachers with ample opportunities for students to receive and implement feedback as they continue to learn and grow. Additionally, credit recovery coordinators at each school support and monitor implementation, and they provide another layer of support and guidance for teachers and students through credit recovery. Another example is here on the right from San Antonio ISD, and they actually offer several different ways for students to stay on track. One that we profiled here is the Evening Flex Academy, which offers self-paced courses in the evening for students. The clever move here is that teaching some form of credit recovery is a condition for effective teachers to receive a lead teacher designation and bonus. And thereby, this kind of ensures that effective teachers are the ones that are supporting students and mastering their unfinished learning. In addition to the Flex Academy Evening School, San Antonio also offers independent online courses with regular check-ins with these kind of effective, high-quality teachers and intercession academies as well. So there are a number of kind of flexible supported options for students as they're really trying to kind of master some of these this unfinished learning. I'll pass it over to Eddie.
Thanks, Mark. So, with this research and these examples in mind, we get to, our expertise about how we can use resources, how districts and schools can use this unprecedented infusion of ESSER dollars to provide better credit recovery, to do it sustainably, and to have it be part of some broader strategy. So that's what our second half is going to be about here. So if we'll start with one of the most pressing questions we're getting from districts right now, which is how should I be spending these dollars now and into next year? And we can look at our three areas again as guidance about what the investment targets might be for districts. And so the first is to ensure that there's in-person instructional support. As Mark mentioned, out of the small amount of research about what's effective and what makes it effective credit recovery program, instructional support seems to be the one thing that we have some sense of evidence from a randomized controlled trial about. So if nothing else, making sure that there is instructional support provided in credit recovery programs. Obviously, staffing right now is a challenge in many districts. We're actively supporting districts who are dealing with some serious staffing issues, and so that, but it's likely worth some creative problem solving and to be trying to prioritize that as possible. The second investment target we think is the investment often of staff time to make courses competency based. So one district we spoke with paid teachers and district staff to take existing courses, define the core competencies, develop what the unit assessments and rubrics would be. And this is a short-term cost that they put into this and that they then had, and it makes a good investment over the short term that can have benefits after ESSER sunsets. And the third investment target is about expanding the options for students to catch up. So if you're just offering summer, consider an evening program to be able to reach more students. Like I said about the staffing, given all of the safety and logistical and staffing challenges that districts are facing right now, standing up new options might not be feasible in this moment. But we think that's, summer of 22, we're working with a number of districts thinking about what does summer look like and how can I start now to think about if there's not already strong credit recovery in place, how can I put some research-backed methods in place for credit recovery for that summer. So on the next slide, if we want to think about, and if that's what we'll call the do now, where should I put my ESSER dollars? A big concern that we're helping districts think about is the potential of a fiscal cliff when ESSER ramps down. And so it's important to think about what the recurring and non-recurring costs are and how districts can think about that. So there are some investments that are mainly non-recurring in credit recovery, so mainly curriculum and tech. But really, if we want to provide more instructional support, it's likely that the per unit cost of credit recovery is going up, is what the recommendation means. And we can think about using lower cost staff or using larger group size, but all of that is going to have trade-offs in the amount of instructional support that's provided. So a big piece of sustainability then is to think about reducing the number of units. And that's the amount of time that students are spending in credit recovery and then the demand itself for credit recovery. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to kind of talk about each of those. In thinking about time, a competency-based approach that focuses on just what students need to master can reduce the time. It's important to acknowledge, if we're going to say that this has been used questionably in the past to pass students along by shortening the amount of time they're spending in credit recovery. And so it's important that there are guardrails in place to ensure that there's actual student mastery here. The second piece about time is around scheduling shifts. So semesterizing or trimesters or quarters, quarter-long courses can also shrink the amount in any given course that students need to progress through if they fail that course. So a larger redesign around schedule might enable that shrinking as well. Most importantly, on the next slide, perhaps, is the making investments that can support students before they fail courses. So this is the ounce of prevention approach here. ESSER funds are providing this opportunity to build systems of support with evidence-based strategies. So early warning systems that identify supports earlier for students, academic support structures like tutoring or intervention or flex blocks or double dose courses show evidence of success for students coming behind in math, for example. So all of those academic supports are targets for investment in order to reduce the need for credit recovery, and should be part of this moment as we're thinking about what's broader redesign look like. Then lastly, really, we can think about credit recovery on this second to last slide here. So next here, Amanda, as one place to pilot more targeted and flexible instruction. So an example here, when the pandemic hit, we talked about DCPS's new credit recovery. And when the pandemic hit and school shut down, DCPS rolled out those competency-based courses that they had built for credit recovery to support. That became the basis for a lot of the remote learning that was happening for students that had to work independently. So that they had piloted this approach to competency-based that then got used more broadly. And credit recovery, we want to think about as a safer sandbox in some ways for developing and learning from new approaches. All right, so in summary here, on the last slides, what can we take away that schools and districts can do? First, there's focusing your ESSER investments right now on more supportive, targeted, and flexible credit recovery. In order to be able to afford more in supportive credit recovery, there's considering ways to reduce student time spent through competency-based approaches. There's using this moment to invest in structures that are going to reduce course failure, double dosing, tutoring, flex blocks, and early warning systems. And then lastly, thinking about how credit recovery can be a testing ground for larger change that can be tough to create in a large system, and how can we use credit recovery as the avenue to pilot these smaller changes. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Bob. We've got our contact information there. We'd love to hear from anybody.
Thank you, Eddie and Mark. Folks, if you have questions, comments, please use the chat to put them there. I'll kick it off by asking a question of Eddie and Mark, but really of everyone, because I think this is one where it's going to take really good collective thought, is that we know that one of there is indications that course failures were up last year. And that occurred largely in a virtual or online environment. So there was a subset of kids that maybe did fine before, but actually failed classes in a virtual online environment. The truth is, most districts pre-pandemic had converted almost all of their credit recovery to online systems. So now we're in the position of having kids that failed online saying our go-to recovery strategy is to go back online. So what I'm asking really of Eddie and Mark, if they've heard anything, but also the larger group, if you've heard of anything, are folks thinking of strategies that are not online for credit recovery for this year, in particular for the students who failed their courses online?
I'll start something off, and then, as you say, Bob, would love to hear from the group. And I do think there's a distinction to be made in the examples we're seeing between online. I'm in a credit recovery. I'm in a credit recovery lab with a circulating teacher who is certified in that area, and I'm self-paced going through material, and that is online credit recovery through a program versus I'm at home and I'm dialing into a virtual course that is offered remotely, which that second one looks a lot more like the challenges we had last year. And so it's worth distinguishing between when we say online, like what is the modality, and if I'm there face to face, and that's the reason probably that we're seeing the results that we do see when you do have more instructional support. And in fact, if you look at the Chicago study that we referenced earlier, the course passing rate was the same. There were really three conditions. There was a traditional, I'm going to reteach you the course. And then there was, you're going to be online, but I'm going to be walking around. I'm providing more instructional support. And then it's online, but less instructional support. Those first two conditions had similar results. And so whether the student is doing it online or not, and we can try to tease those apart, and which is the better call, but certainly that actually being in person now that we can do that. So just want to distinguish that, but love to hear others' thoughts.
It's a great point.
We have a question in the chat. Which strategy is working best for students who have special education supports?
Love a clarification in terms of which strategy within credit recovery or as intervention beforehand.
I'm not sure. Linda,
Yep.
Can you clarify?
Credit recovery, but I'm also curious about the other way you're asking it to.
Yep.
If you could touch on both, please.
Yes, I will say that this is where we get to the edge of where we've explored, and so I'm not sure that we have much to offer specifically on what's working better for credit recovery and special education. And I will say that I have not seen any research either way that specifically has studied special education.
Thank you.
But if others know of any, please speak up.
All right, well, if you get questions come, please put them in the chat and we will again have time at the end. Oh, here we go. We got one more. Okay. At least a comment.
Yes, I am going outside the box here, but when are we as a system of educators going to start reflecting upon what we were doing before the pandemic? Whether, I guess, how effective it was. Maybe we have to have so much credit recovery because what we are teaching is not meaningful to students. Does every student need Algebra 2? Why do we have students in 6 classes a day? Why does AP dominate for high achieving students? Yet APIB does no teacher training on developmental needs of teenagers. I want us as an education system to move to something besides reactive modes.
I'll say one piece and then Bob, they'll pick it up. As you laid out, Bob, in the order of our presentations, do this well, where we are the end of the chain that when things haven't gone right, what can you do to make them right? And that's why as we're thinking about, at least if you're going to invest in credit recovery, invest in what the supports are before. And then I think this is getting to like, okay, well, let's even think about what the courses you had them in the first place that need support. And that's when I think we can move back up the chain where Bob, you're going to take us.
Yeah, I think that's a very good segue into our next segment. And but also to point out that to the point that Eddie and Mark made is that we really want to reduce course failure so we don't have to have credit recovery. So that does involve going upstream to thinking about how to have kids succeed the first time. And that includes some of the ideas you have, or taking it a step further and saying, we actually have to redesign the high school because the architecture we inherited from the 1950s when the neighborhood high school was sort of born and invented. It was a very different time than the 2021. And that really speaks to the project that we've been working on, the Everyone Graduates Center, over the past 4 or 5 years with 5 or 6 states. Next slide, Amanda. Is how can evidence-based practices be customized to local circumstances by school-based design teams? So the school itself, composed of teachers and leaders and students and community members, to create high schools which meets the needs of the 21st century, right, not of the 20th century, and provide all students with a pathway to adult success. So that's trying to get at how do we make the design work for everybody on the front end. And that, it really speaks to this idea that the high schools almost all of us went to were designed to have this, when high school was the endpoint of public education for most students. And now high school is the starting point almost of the transition to adult success and additional schooling and training. And that's a big shift. And schools have not been given the time to redesign to meet that new goal. They have the design for the old goal and find it hard to find the time to create the redesign for the new goal. So that's what we've been working with the CCSSO and Louisiana, Mississippi, New York, Ohio, New York, and Massachusetts. And we've been actually leveraging ESSER, of all things, as a framework to enable this. Because ESSER has within it one of its few remaining federal mandates is if your high school has a grad rate below 67%, you're supposed to engage in comprehensive evidence-based reforms, but they're supposed to generate from first the school and the district, right? It's not so much like, here's a model, pick it. It's like, analyze your data, get input from your community, figure out what evidence-based strategies would work, and propose that. So that actually provides a nice framework actually for redesign, as opposed to really under earlier school reform things where it was more about specific models. So one of the things we learned, and to make it different, is that the schools that still had grad rates below 67%, by 2017, were schools that have been under pressure for 2 decades often to get better. Really, the sort of standards and accountability structures had not worked for them. They've been told to get better or else for 2 decades, and it hadn't happened. So we thought we really had to flip the script. And that's why we really went to this redesign idea. And really this idea of making it about hopeful, positive, future orientated, as opposed to saying, you're a bad school, you better get better or else. We're trying to say, the world has changed and you've had a time to change your high school for that world. Let's use these structures to give you that time. And it was really about being both evidence-based, but locally customized, right? Not saying there's one way that fits all, but we have to mesh evidence with local needs and insights. And then a big learning we had was that it's easy to say, make things evidence-based, but when you get down to actually a dialogue with folks at a school, it's like, how do you translate that into stuff that's actionable for them? And what we learned is it really helped to break it down into 4 areas that were sort of more or less under their control. How they organize their adults, how they do teaching and learning, how they support students, and how they build these post-secondary pathways. And then we also recognized there were some key mindsets that this should really be put at the center of sort of community economic and social integration efforts. Because in many of these places where we still have low graduation rate high schools, they're in places that have 1 or 2 or 3 high schools in the whole town, right? They're not so much just the big districts with 10, 20, 30 high schools. And in places where you have 1, 2, or 3 high schools, they are very central to the sort of spirit of the community. And you have to sort of lean into that. It's important that us be participatory, but we need to design for equity, which means meaningful participation of those impacted by the inequities that exist. And it's really important to be networked, right? It's really, we're going to come back, it's really hard to reform alone. So a couple of things we learned along the way, next slide, is that mindsets really matter. Too often, I think, and we've done school reform for 25 years and we're as guilty of this as anybody else, you lead with the practices. Here's the evidence-based practices. Let's try to get high fidelity implementation. Let's give you training and support to make that happen. And if you don't pay attention to the underlying mindsets, we get superficial implementation that lasts for a short period of time. Because if people are, we'll do it because we have to, or they're telling us to, or we'll give it a try. But in my heart of hearts, I don't really believe it, right? And so that's why it's really important to get to those underlying mindsets and mental models. And it's particularly important for this because we all did go to high schools that were largely traditionally structured, which created a mental map in our head of just what high school should be and led to we just don't question a lot of assumptions because we think that's just what it is. So we found really freeing up people to just think about some of the underlying assumptions of how high schools were constructed can be quite liberating because it lets you say, like, it doesn't there are models beyond what you experienced. Next slide. We talked about a little bit the importance to organize the evidence base into ways that can be remembered, and even like taglines that sort of pull it together. So for organizing adults, we say like it's deep premises, it's teams, not individuals, right? Traditionally, high schools are very individually organized. You have your teaching schedule, you teach 150 kids, you teach across grades. No one else knows like what your schedule is, really, right? Maybe you're a department chair. You don't know who your kids' science, social studies, or English teachers are if you're a math teacher, because it's all individually scheduled, right? So it becomes very individualistic, right? And we know that to progress, it's really about team-based work. Students at the center, right? We know it's really this idea of building hope, agency, trust, and relationship. So that's what we're learning. You have to create both the organization and almost the mnemonics to help the school staff be able to digest this evidence base and think about applying it. Next slide. And we then created a website that helped give access to this. And one thing we learned about in doing the website was we needed to both have a section on for each of these, like what the evidence says, which was, they're asked like, was this an evidence-based strategy? How do we know? Like you need a quick place to go, like this shows the evidence. But to be really impactful, we needed a second section, which was, how do we use this evidence? And that's where we have like videos and guidebooks and like applications and schools to visit. Because again, at the school level, they need to check the box that it's evidence-based, but they need that guidance about how you actually make it applicable. Next slide. Next slide, Amanda. Sorry. Are you stuck? You might be stuck. Well, so the other thing we learned beyond this, is we lost our deck. We'll get it back, is that, once you have the evidence, there is, thank you, Amanda. So student and community voice are very important, right? And what we found in working with about 75 schools so far is those that most incorporated student and community voice in their redesign efforts, that really took the time to talk to students and their community about what they want in their schools, really actually selected the most innovative in their thinking and bold in their actions. That actually talking to the students emboldened them to do more than they might be willing to do on their own. And that we found was, we didn't necessarily anticipate that, but we found that was actually empowering to feel, oh, maybe we can be bolder in our show. Maybe we can really change the schedule. Or maybe we can really change it because, like, in fact, that's what our kids and community are like thinking is important, as opposed to like, how are we ever going to convince people to do something different than they've done before? That seems overwhelming. So really getting the voices of the people involved in this was actually, again, created more agency among the folks in the school that they just had to try to imagine what might be possible ourselves. Next slide. Known as hard, it's really important to network folks so they can learn from each other and just often just see that there are other people facing the same challenges. We've heard this again and again. Like, it was so liberating to know that it wasn't just us, that we weren't the only ones struggling with us. There wasn't something wrong with us because we hadn't figured this out. All right, next slide. And then finally, just some very key process learnings. It's important when they, again, like, who's on this redesign team? How big, how small, like, and we typically found, bigger until they get too big. It's hard to quantify that, is good. But really what the schools pointed out is that we needed to make sure that people were on that. There were some folks that really had long-term commitments to the school and the community. One school even said, like, you need the folks that are like the cement there, that aren't going to be gone in 2 years, right? Because if your key folks doing the design are very transient, it doesn't stick. We've learned you need about 6 to 9 months just to think through redesign before you're actually trying to do it, though you might be piloting some things. And we needed some structure in that to make that time useful, right? And next slide. And we'll be next one. Okay. Another thing that again surprised us is we found that sometimes an old-fashioned resource guide and workbook can have utility, right? Everything is supposed to be online and video and short and brief. And we found, and we kept adapting it, that many schools just like to have a little guidebook that they could refer to, not to drive things, not to be paint by numbers, but to help them when they had to catch somebody up, when they had to bring somebody new on, when they had to sort of frame the journey for somebody else, when they had to talk to a stakeholder. It was nice to actually have a little like just old-fashioned piece of paper that you could refer to and look through, even though it's available online. All right. And, initial impact. So complicated by the pandemic, but nearly all the schools of the 75 have engaged in substantial redesign actions. Some we would say are doing good evidence-based practices that you might not find earth-shakingly innovative, but for them, they were. Like even things like having a 9th grade academy, right? For a school, it's always been departmentalized and always had, the best teachers teach the most advanced kids, right? To reframe that is a big change. Others, amazingly creative stuff. One school redesigned their whole schedule. So every course is a single credit. And to do Algebra 3, you put 3 of them together and they can have them be different applications in each of those three credits. And the reason they did that, one reason is for kids that sometimes struggle, they might struggle near the end of the class and they don't get any credit for the first part where they did okay. So this was the idea that like, if you have a good run of 7 weeks, you can earn a credit. And at least you have that foundation. So, that you think about, that's a very radical change for a school to go from sort of a traditional 3 credits, semester, year-long classes to suddenly say, we're creating all these modules. And the majority of schools report that this process was better than other school improvement processes. So to learn more, you can visit our website and stay tuned for a forthcoming report. And with that, I'll open it up briefly for questions. And then we'll also come back to questions at the end, because I want to also make sure that we let Joel take us one step further.
This might be a segue even in some ways, or preparation for Joel's presentation. But Dan from Advanced CTE put into the chat a report that they've put out on the importance of student voice for career tech ed specifically.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you for that. I think it is a good segue. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Joel to share with you their thinking at Jobs for the Future on ways to redesign the whole high school to post-secondary system. Joel, it's all yours.
Hey, thank you, Bob. And thanks to everyone on your team at the Everyone Graduate Center. And thanks to Eddie and Mark. It's kind of humbling to come in after this, because I feel like your work is built on so many years of experience and is so practical in terms of its learning and application. And I feel like, well, I'm the heretic in the crowd now. It is kind of, it is an answer to the same question, but it is a little bit more of a radical vision. So I just want to start there. It's something we've been thinking about for a while, but admittedly, the pandemic seemed to really kind of raise interest for doing things differently. So we put this idea out in the field to see what kind of change we could make. And just by way of introduction, real quick, I'm a vice president at JFF. We're a national nonprofit that tries to drive change in the workforce and education systems in the country, and to try to really ensure that it improves economic advancement for more people. And that work and it is often done by designing and scaling solutions with policymakers, system leaders, philanthropy, and entrepreneurs. I'm going to talk about this white paper, which we present this vision called The Big Blur. It's a pretty audacious set of recommendations. It kind of questions, it really does question why we keep trying to build better bridges between high school, college, and careers, when those divisions, as you were saying, Bob, are really vestiges of a past age and industrial age economy, and the transition points to lose students at every critical juncture. And so what we're arguing for are new structures that would better serve 16 to 20-year-old young adults. And one way to think about that is as 2 years of college included in high school, or 2 years of high school included in college. But really, we're talking about institutions that would be neither high schools nor community colleges, but new configurations for all students. And they would be free for students. They'd include, if some of you follow community college reform, they've instituted guided pathways, which are really sort of more student-centered paths and choice architecture, so that students are in labor market aligned sequences of course taking. And sometimes we would include, work-based learning experiences as part of that experience, and reaching down into the high school with guided pathways, co-designed with regional employers, so that the credentials students receive actually give them direct access to the labor market and further post-secondary education should they want to keep going. And so I would just say the idea is born out of impatience. So Amanda, if you go to the next slide, please. I mean, for one thing, just a macro view, among other data points we have in the paper, the improvements that we're seeing in post-secondary attainment are really incremental and slow, especially for Black, Latinx students and people from low-income backgrounds. And we're pretty good, and we're getting better at increasing access to post-secondary experiences. But so many students go on and they don't succeed, and that doesn't do any good. In fact, it exacerbates economic inequity, because if they drop out while taking on big debt, that puts them in a hole that's hard to get out of. Could you go to the next slide, please? I just, down from the macro view, although here's some more stats for you, just share my own personal discontents and impatience to give you a background about why we penned this idea, and that it includes my own experience as a first-gen college goer and my later professional experience trying to support first-generation college goers, really sort out and navigate through all the financing, prerequisites, academic preparation, admissions processes, kind of not to mention the most self-confidence, identity, efficacy, belongingness issues. These are like big gaps that seem designed to really block students from going to and completing college. And that's not even to mention finding a college path that's aligned to a career path, or at least gainful employment. So the little program I got raised in that changed my life, it helped me meet these challenges, and then later inspired others that I designed and led kinds of programs. They're just few and far between, and not enough. Even if you put them all together, they're not going to be at sufficient scale to meet the need to overcome what are absurdly high barriers to access and success in post-secondary attainment. So it actually, many years ago now, more than I like to admit, it actually is what brought me to and attracted me to the work of early college high schools, which JFF helped to mobilize, and still in different ways now we've mobilized for so many years. And those schools have increasingly incorporated career pathways, the valuable post-secondary credentials and degrees, and they modeled to me what a more streamlined set of transitions could look like. But part of my impatience is that work is also frustratingly slow to grow and arduous to operate because of the differences that the partnerships have to reconcile between secondary and post-secondary, scheduling systems, faculty requirements, funding flows and restrictions, among other things. So, our team, as part of the background for this paper, really noted with great interest the range of related efforts like to early college that are trying to change post-secondary outcomes by reorganizing support systems, instructional delivery, guidance counseling, financing, and work-based learning across K-12 and post-secondary. So next slide, please. These are just some of the names of the people we spoke to. I know, sorry, tiny print here, but we spoke to a lot of innovative practitioners and policymakers, policy influencers who are trying to implement these kinds of approaches that blur boundaries a bit between secondary, post-secondary, and work. So it includes strong high schools, which increasingly found that preparing their students for college was not sufficient to see them succeed in college, and they started to see them extend their support systems and scaffold into grade 13-year programs, including by developing online blended college courses and brick and mortar partnerships with colleges locally. And developing work-based learning experiences with employers, all to create kind of like more critical momentum for their students through some college with a stronger career orientation. And then we talked to college leaders of colleges who are trying to reach down in the high schools, including with dual enrollment opportunities, sometimes wedded in the best of all cases with guided pathways that try to give students an accelerated boost into post-secondary programs of study. And then we work with colleges that are also trying to streamline and reduce costs through improved transfer by streamlining back office functions, consolidating even, and by designing learn and earn partnerships for their students. And we also spoke with system leaders and policy makers who are adjusting graduation requirements to make space for more future-oriented courses and experiential activities. We're trying to use coordinated policy making across systems to improve alignment and create pathways. So many of them, when we talked to these folks, they kind of shared similar impatience, although they really are trying to tinker in the way that they can towards utopia. But and their efforts are all trying to ameliorate, but also are limited by the systems fragmentation that I've been talking about, policy disincentives and mindsets, to go back to something Bob mentioned, that really are grounded in archetypes, right, about the way schooling should be structured, and that transition between high school, college, and work should be structured and sequenced. So those were fundamental limitations that many of them cited. So the Big Blur tries to flip the script and propose a new narrative. Like, what if instead of building models like these that work in spite of and around systems as we have them, like as band-aids, one-off workarounds, patches, what if we built systems and new types of institutions that are made to do by design what the models are trying to fix, and make them unnecessary, because what those models do would become the new normal. So that was kind of the thinking behind the paper. And based on historical work in the field and our experience and efforts, the research suggested a number of features that would be essential to this kind of system. So if you go to the next slide, please, Amanda, thanks. You need new kinds of incentive structures to promote new ways of organizing learning and support systems across grades 11 through 14. The systems would be held accountable for defined outcomes in this period, and current funding streams could be braided, used flexibly, and dedicated ones would be created as needed for systems serving students in these grades. You need to see intentional and required alignment of systems, enabling 11th grade students to enter new institutional structures that incorporate high school and college requirements, designed for career preparation and incorporating work experience. So the structures would enable students to take incremental steps on a career pathway and result in labor market credentials with labor market value by the end of grade 14, and an ability to continue on in further education. Really, the devil will be in the design details. There should be no dead ends in this kind of Big Blur structure. You need governance, a team or an empowered senior leader with decision-making authority to oversee, ensure funding for, and support an integrated and unified grades 11 through 14 that includes pathways aligned to the state's economic development strategy. And you need new kinds of staffing structures, and educators design who are especially equipped, trained to teach, curate, and organize learning and work experiences and support systems for students in grades 11 through 14. So I'm going to stop pretty soon because I said a lot here. I'm just going to shortly say, and I imagine this will come up in the line of questioning as well, which I welcome. This will take a shift in our thinking about public responsibility for post-secondary education. We typically have seen college being seen as an individual sort of responsibility with an individual return on investment. And we think that in order to realize a vision like this, the public will have to begin to see post-secondary education more like bridges and roads. They benefit all of us. And it's not just, I think a big part of how we would know that that's happening is, obviously this free college movement, college promise, is a good leading indicator, but we would even go much farther. Even if some version of that passes, we would say that's not enough, that actually what we need to have the public understand is seeing post-secondary success as a public responsibility. That includes financing, but also includes all the scaffolding and supports that we see some of these models trying to implement for their students. I can talk a little bit more about some of the opportunity and road ahead. It's there needs to be some narrative shift work that goes on. JFF hopes to continue to support that. There's unprecedented stimulus funding, as we talked about earlier. Mark and Eddie coming to K-12 colleges and other entities. The challenge is that because a lot of the dollars to date have flowed with few strings attached, there's no incentive for locals to do anything differently. So the flip side of that is that there are those who have already have some precedent and potential for doing work that blurs boundaries. And we can leverage those investments, we think, to accelerate their efforts with the right kinds of encouragement and support. We know JFF has supported some regions that have done this kind of work before on pathway systems, and hold promise to do more aggressive blurring is our bet. So our next phase of work on the big blur is really about trying to advance the vision by understanding how we could drive it through different units of change, including systems, policies, models, regions, and a campaign to shift narratives and mindsets. So we're hopeful that there may be some states, places where there would be kind of this superfecta of conditions, all four, that could be leveraged to build a big blur demo. So I'll stop there and thank everyone again in advance for the questions and for the invitation to be here and be the heretic.
Thank you, Joel. And I think you're less of a heretic than you might think, especially among the folks that are involved in this on a day-to-day basis in the district and school and levels, that live this life and live the frustrations and see the outcomes of our current system. I invite people to ask questions now of Joel, of Eddie, of myself, and also to share if you have any ideas or reflections of what a reimagined high school or high school post-secondary system in the post-pandemic world might look like, or might involve, or might need to. And I'm giving you a moment to do that. I'm just going to have two quick reflections on Joel's presentation. First, I think you're almost too kind, Joel. There's just a lot of pure insanity out there right now in how we've structured this. And the one that just really drives home for me is we could see from the survey data of students who graduated high school in 2020 and 21 and paused on post-secondary because of a lot of uncertainty. And they're saying, like, I really needed more guidance. I really needed more structure. I really needed more pathways. On one hand, at the K-12 level, and the utter panic that I lived through at the higher ed level, that, oh my God, our enrollments are going to go down, or we're going to have to start firing all our staff. When really all they had to do was reach out and give those kids the guidance they wanted. But they didn't know where to find them. Even though they are their customers in a sense, or they are their people who come to them, there are all these kids looking for guidance. There's all these institutions with lots of resources. Instead of like using them to create the guidance to get the kids to fill their enrollments, they just started cutting back on staff, right? And that to me is insanity and shows how deep the divide is between those systems and how dysfunctional. And then the other thing I would add is that this idea that 11th and 12th graders are capable of much more than the current system gives them credit. And I think where we're seeing them like saying that in ways that may or may not be beneficial long-term to them is that the increase of youth working during the pandemic, often because they had to help support their families, and gaining agency from that. And now a number of the principals we work are saying for the first time in their life, they feel like they're fighting the labor market for the attention of their 11th and 12th graders, because they're attempting to keep their hours and go to school. And the system is not designed to accommodate that. But I think a lot of them said, wow, I can do a heck of a lot more out in the world than the school lets me do now. Like, what's the point about going back to school, missing a little bit that a job that seems pretty good at 17 isn't going to look so great at 25. So I think there's just a lot of evidence out there that like, this is like it is insanity to like keep the current system the way it is.
Totally agree, Bob. And seeing those strange kinds of patterns and a lack of kind of imagination around, oh, maybe that means we should do things a bit differently here.
And we're getting a lot of comments in the chat. I don't know if you want to share a few.
So several people have expressed their appreciation for Joel's presentation, that this is exciting. Someone has mentioned that Robert Nelson and Kathy Hart in California, Nelson of Sacramento State and Kathy from Delta College, formerly of Delta College, would be great thought partners. Marla says one of the big obstacles in her district is the secondary teachers themselves, how to convince them that what they've been doing for 20 years is not really working. And Elizabeth says a good place to start is reimagining the senior year, because typically the only requirements in senior year in many states are government and English 4. Also, Colorado succeeds is passing legislation along the lines of what you are advocating for, and she's included a link. And Brandy says we have the option for students to attend in person or remote. The remote is working for some, but many use it as an excuse to stay enrolled without doing the work. How to use EWS to address that. Dan from Advanced CTE, a distinct separation between the institutions, as you've noted, and as a big blur starts, how can institutions adapt to create a true post-secondary system rather than competition between institutions? So there's some things to work on.
These are great. These are great. I mean, Dan's comment, and I imagine that my fellow panelists here, including Bob, have some reactions to this too. Dan, I really appreciate that comment. I mean, it brings home again, and then I tie it back to whoever talked about how can we get high school teachers to kind of be thinking differently. I mean, this is just to state the obvious. So all this is so hard to unravel because we have created these systems where there becomes turf. And not just turf, but like people's identities are bound up in what they are as a high school teacher, what it means to be college faculty. And those are the big, to me, like in addition to the mindsets, about what the systems are and the archetypes, it is that kind of identity and how the bureaucracies have brought people up. I mean, I'm a creature of those as well, like nonprofitsville, wherever we come from, right? So it is going to be tough, kind of like people to people work at the end of the day to show like you can build something new here, but easier said than done.
Well, thank you, everybody. That was, I think, a very stimulating, I hope, for everybody, set of presentations today, and really getting at this idea we do need to reimagine. I think it's clear, but our high schools and our high school to post-secondary system, not only in a post-pandemic world, but just to thrive in the 21st century world we live in. And we saw today a range of ways to get started from, a good first step is to, reimagine credit recovery as a more competency-based endeavor and use that as a way to get your feet wet into competency-based work. Some of the work we've been doing about giving school design teams the space and time to reimagine their school and some tools and processes to do that. And then all the way through to Joel's not so heretical idea that we really have to reshape the whole 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old space, or we're just going to keep getting at best that incremental improvement, and maybe even stall and start losing some kids, saying like, we're not waiting for this long system. We're going to try to go make our life work the best we can without you, and see where that goes. So thank everybody. We will be sending this out. We'll be sending out all the resources and a lot of links that people share. We'll share those out as well. I encourage you to attend our next 2 upcoming solution forums on November 16th and December 14th. And with that, we thank you, be well, and onwards. Take care.